Apple has just released the MacBook Neo, a $600 laptop based on the A18 Pro chip found in iPhone 16 Pro. In this video, we will discuss whether the MacBook Neo is any good for filmmakers. We'll focus on DaVinci Resolve, but also evaluate its usability for other tasks like media management. Discussing a $600 computer as an editing machine might seem unlikely, but it's more viable than you might think. For many people, it might be the only option they have, and insights on how little power you actually need to edit could be useful. We have the MacBook Neo in hand, ready to test. But before we begin, there's already a lot that we do know. In Geekbench, the Neo scores around 3,500 single-core, 8,700 multi-core, and 31,000 in metal. That's incredibly close to the performance of the MacBook Pro M1. We have an M1, DaVinci Resolve works great on it, so we are confident it will work equally as well on the Neo. But there are some key differences. The Neo has better single-core and multi-core CPU performance, while its GPU score lags slightly behind the M1. The MacBook Neo only has 8GB of RAM. The A18 Pro has a ProRes encode-decode engine, the M1 does not. The Neo does not have Thunderbolt, it has one USB-C 3 port and one USB-C 2 port. And finally, the A18 Pro and M series chips share a similar architecture, but target different use cases. How will those factors affect the Neo's performance?
We're going to use our free benchmark to compare overall performance. You can learn more about it by watching this video. There is a link in the description. Here's the Neo's score. And for reference, here is the MacBook Pro M1. That's a huge difference given that the Neo and M1 MacBook Pro's synthetic benchmarks were so close. According to those synthetic scores, the Neo should be capable of more closely matching the M1 scores, but something is evidently holding it back. Those synthetic scores target the CPU and GPU but don't account for other bottlenecks that might exist in the system. So what holds the Neo back? The answer, as predicted, is RAM. I've loaded DaVinci Resolve, created a project, imported media, and created a simple timeline. This is ProRes 422 UHD at 60 frames per second recorded on an iPhone 16 Pro. Activity Monitor reveals that DaVinci Resolve's RAM usage sits at around 2.5 GB. Performance is excellent and with full real-time playback. Adding moderate color grading effects to the timeline has a minimal effect on RAM consumption, and performance is still excellent. Take note what happens when I add this 8.6K XOCN light file from the Burano. There's a significant jump in memory consumption. That's because the engine and processes for decoding XOCN must be loaded into memory in order for Resolve to play back that XOCN. Any additional feature that I load places further demands on the system's memory. For example, when using transcription, Resolve has to load the neural engine used for transcription into memory. Remember, the AI in Resolve runs locally. It doesn't use cloud compute. At this point, the amount of memory that Resolve is using exceeds the 8GB of RAM that the Neo has. But Resolve is still able to function thanks to three processes happening in the operating system: paging, swapping, and compression. The first is swapping. That's moving an entire process from RAM to the computer's disk. That's helpful if an app has been minimized or is inactive. The second is paging. That's moving portions of a process from RAM to the computer's disk. And the final process is compression. That's applying compression to data that is in the RAM so it takes up less space.
There's additional data you can expose in Mac's operating system's activity monitor. Turn on real memory and compressed memory. Real memory shows how much RAM Resolve is actually using. VM compressed shows an active memory, memory that's not currently in use by the program, that has been compressed. That memory might still be in the physical RAM, or it might have been moved to a page or swap file on the internal SSD. The command line tool VMMAP can help you get even more granular. Resident memory lets you know how much physical RAM Resolve is using.
You can see that Resolve's actual RAM utilization is much lower than its advertised memory usage. A great deal of its memory will either be compressed or paged or swapped to the internal SSD. This isn't just because the Neo only has 8GB of RAM though. This also happens on computers with significantly more RAM.
Our MacBook Pro M4 Max with 48GB of RAM does the exact same thing. Mac OS is always actively managing RAM to keep only necessary data. Hopefully, all this helps gives you a better understanding of how DaVinci Resolve uses RAM and how a modern computer can get by with just 8 GB.
Back to the benchmark. An examination of the activity monitor and VM map tool gives some interesting insights. The M1 MacBook Pro's resident memory utilization during the benchmark is around 4 GB. Take note that within the activity monitor, compressed memory is stable. That's an indication that memory is not being actively compressed or decompressed. Or in other words, the compressed memory is not needed while Resolve is rendering. Finally, GPU utilization is maxed out and constant, an indication that there are not other processes causing a performance bottleneck. On the other hand, the MacBook Neo's resident memory utilization during the benchmark is around 1 GB. Compressed memory is constantly changing, an indication that memory is being actively compressed and decompressed. Of course, the memory pressure graph gives an indication that there are issues too. Finally, GPU utilization is not maxed out and it's patchy, an indication that paging and compression are causing latency. The GPU is having to wait as memory is shuttled back and forth between the disk and RAM. Is more RAM better? Yes. But beyond a critical threshold, system performance doesn't scale proportionally with RAM. You either have enough or you don't. In the instance of our benchmark, it would seem that an additional 4 GB would be sufficient. Any more memory on top of that would not be used. 16 GB of RAM was sufficient on our M1 and M4. In the case of the Neo, even a small bump to 12 GB might be enough to address Resolve's needs. There are some exceptions though. For example, Fusion likes to use RAM for caching. And as the complexity of the AI models used in Resolve increases, you'll naturally need more RAM to load and run those models. So what can you do with the Neo? Can you still use the Neo for editing? Yes. Remember, it rendered our benchmark just fine. It just took a long time. And in this heavy timeline, performance is laggy. But not in the same way it was on the M1 or M4. On those computers, Resolve is still responsive, but on the Neo, as you're waiting for swapping or compression, the system hangs. This video is sponsored by Audiio, where with our discount code, you can get 70% off an entire year of royalty-free music. We use Audiio for all of our music. I'd like to highlight a genuinely useful feature, and that is their phone app. The homepage features new artists and playlists. That's a great place to start if you don't know what you're looking for yet. If you're out and about, when you've got time to kill, instead of listening to the music you already know, you can explore Audio's library and start building ideas for your next edit. If you're looking for something specific, head to search. You can do all the normal stuff like search through song titles, artists, and keywords, or you can hit this button in the middle. This is Hands AI. It understands the music in Audio's library. You can either describe the kind of song you're looking for or describe the kind of video you're looking to make. Either way, when you find songs you like, mark them as a favorite. Now, when you sit down to start editing, instead of starting from zero, you're already ahead. You can get an entire year of Audio Pro for just $60 using our discount code in the description. Unsurprisingly, the Neo is a bad recommendation for a full-time editor. But there's a large audience who might buy this laptop because it's all they can afford, or have subsequently decided to dabble in filmmaking. Well, in that scenario, the best computer is the one that you have. The Neo becomes workable and better matches the performance of the M1 when the complexity of the project decreases. Here's an example. This timeline is filled with UHD 60 FPS ProRes 422 media shot on an iPhone 16 Pro. I've also applied minor color corrections. It plays back beautifully. Because there's only one type of media in the timeline, only one decoding engine needs to be loaded into RAM. Now that aggressive and frequent swapping is no longer necessary. My performance bottleneck now returns to being the CPU and GPU. A fantastic way to get more timeline performance from your computer is to drop the playback resolution. This affects your preview, it doesn't affect delivery. With my resolution at half, I can stack 10 ProRes clips and possibly more on top of each other. I've set their opacity to 50% to force Resolve to play them all, and I still get real-time playback. I can apply effects like the film look creator and still get real-time playback. I can even apply noise reduction and still get near real-time playback. And please remember that I'm demonstrating with footage shot at 60 frames per second, so you'd get twice the performance at 30 frames per second. The Neo is a fantastic companion for media shot on a phone, action cam, drone, or mirrorless. Once the project is able to fit within the confines of what that 8 GB can supply, The Neo can now match the performance of the M1. This simpler test timeline renders marginally slower than the M1, but that's to be expected as the A18 Pro's GPU Geekbench score was slightly slower than the M1. Remember, Resolve is heavily GPU optimized and less reliant on the CPU. The Neo is an incredible computer. It was never built for editing workloads, and it's to its credit that it can handle them so well. Expect performance on par with an M1 in light workloads. But remember, as soon as you exceed the Neo's 8GB of RAM, performance will decrease. RAM is important, but Mac computers are so efficient with RAM that they are generally able to maintain performance with less RAM than you would spec on an equivalent Windows system.
Every MacBook from the Air to the Pro features Thunderbolt 4 as a minimum. The Neo only has a single USB 3 port that supports speeds up to 10 gigabits per second and a single USB 2 port that supports 480 megabits per second. If you need to connect a drive to your Neo, you can connect it to either port, but you'll get a different experience. This crucial flash drive supports 20 gigabit, so the Neo's 10 gigabit port will already limit its speed, and the 480 port will limit it even further. But that doesn't matter because typical media doesn't require that sort of throughput. Here's a list of media that you might work with an indication of which port you need to connect your drive to. So, if you work with H.264 or H.265 clips recorded on the excellent Blackmagic camera app, you'd get smooth timeline performance even with your drive connected to the USB 2 port. The advantage of using the USB 2 port for storage is that you can use the USB 3 port to drive an external monitor. If an external monitor is a must and that USB 2 port isn't fast enough, don't forget you can make use of a proxy workflow. Learn more about that here. In summary, the Neo's I/O is acceptable for the kind of editing you're likely to do on the Neo. On the other hand, if you are buying a Neo for data management, that's a bad idea, as you'll have to use the USB 2 port to connect either your shuttle drive or camera card. For that kind of work, you want an Air or Pro with multiple Thunderbolt ports to be able to dump cards quickly. Here's a transfer on the Neo from the USB 2 port to the USB 3 port, compared with the transfer using 2 Thunderbolt ports on a MacBook Pro. Can you spot the difference? If you need to manage data on a Neo, you're better off using the USB-C hub so that your media and shuttle drive can share the 10 gigabit available on the USB 3 port. Notice the improved transfer speed. Who is this for? Realistically, an established professional filmmaker will not be purchasing the MacBook Neo. The MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro offer better performance and also better value when you compare performance to cost. Here's 3 groups of people we think might be interested in the Neo. First, the "it's all I need" group. That might be someone who isn't a filmmaker and just needs a laptop. If you decide to do some casual editing in DaVinci Resolve, the Neo has you covered. Second is the "it's all I can afford" group. Those whose budget is tight but have aspirations to use this computer for filmmaking. Again, the Neo has you covered. The best computer is the one you can afford. Your talent and enthusiasm can overcome the limitations of your hardware. And as your career grows, we hope you can graduate to a more powerful computer when the time is right. Third is the "it's all I want to spend" group. This group includes filmmakers with bigger and more powerful machines, but who are looking to purchase a cheap second computer for the road or for the couch. And for this, the Neo is an interesting prospect. You can do most things on it, but there's some cool scenarios where we think it might excel. It pairs really nicely with Blackmagic Cloud. We use a cloud project library and typically ingest our media on other computers that generates and uploads proxies. While traveling, we can access projects, download proxy media, and edit on the go. That fits perfectly within the storage and compute capabilities of the Neo. Or it works great for media managing simple shoots where its reduced speed isn't critical. For example, when traveling with a mirrorless that produces smaller files than a heftier camera. Don't forget, this computer only costs $600. Well, actually $700 for this one. You might have noticed that we opted for the larger storage and Touch ID, but performance is identical. If you have $600 to spend on your dream editing machine, get the Mac Mini M4 or the M5 whenever that comes out. If a laptop is a must, consider whether your budget will extend to the MacBook Air. You'll get twice the performance RAM and storage. If your budget won't budge, or you have a more casual use case in mind, go ahead. Give the Neo a try. It's a great computer, but when you consider its price, it's an amazing computer. We highly recommend the storage upgrade to 512 gigabytes. Here's some secondhand options to consider. If your budget is super tight, you can buy the original 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro secondhand. It's cheaper, has better I/O, but it's not as fast as the Neo. If you have a little bit more to spend, you can find great deals on the 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, consider sharing it, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on our next video. Thanks for watching.